Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and we're back here today with another edition of Budget Magic from MTGGoldfish.com. So this week we are heading to Modern to play a deck called 8-Rack. So 8-Rack is a real deck in Modern, so this isn't one of my crazy brews. This is actually a real deck, but we're playing a budget version of it. The real version, or the non-budget version, is actually kind of expensive because it plays a full set of Liliana the Veil, which is like almost $400 all by itself. Our version, though, as you can see, comes in at 48 bucks in paper and only 50 ticks online. And that's not a mistake. It is actually more expensive on Magic Online than it is in paper. I think this is the first time in the history of Budget Magic that the deck is actually more expensive online. And that's because the rack, the rack, in paper has a bunch of different printings, but in Magic Online it only has one printing, and that printing is time shifted. So time shifted is pretty low supply, so a playset of the rack is like 35 bucks on Magic Online, and that makes up most of the cost of the deck. Anyway, this is a discard deck, so our main goal is to get our opponent's hand empty as fast as possible, and then kill them with our 8 racks. So we have 4 actual The Racks, a 1 converted mana cost artifact, and it says if an opponent has 3 or fewer cards in hand during his or her upkeep, the rack does 1 damage to opponent for each card fewer than 3. So despite its mathy flavor and archaic wording, what the rack is trying to say is if an opponent has 0 cards in hand on their upkeep, the rack lava spikes them, does 3 damage. If they have 1 card, it does 2 damage. If they have 2 cards, it does 1 damage. If they have 3, 4, 5, 8, 14, 27, it does 0 damage. So the rack does nothing unless an opponent has 2 or fewer cards in hand on their upkeep. But then it's free damage, repeatable damage every turn, and can close out the game pretty quickly. Shrieking Affliction is rack 5 through 8, and it's a little bit different but pretty similar. It's a 1 black mana enchantment, and it says at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has 1 or fewer cards in hand, he or she loses 3 life. So the big difference is the rack triggers for 1 damage if an opponent has 2 cards in hand. Shrieking Affliction does nothing if an opponent has 2 cards in hand at the beginning of their upkeep. You have to have 1 or 0 cards in their hand, but then Shrieking Affliction does all 3 damage. So it's not as variable and doesn't have that weird mathy flavor that the rack does. But the basic idea is we'll get 1 or 2 or more of these cards on the battlefield, and then we empty our opponent's hand with discard spells, and then in the course of about 3 turns, our rack effects will take away our opponent's entire life total, and since our opponent is empty-handed, it's unlikely they'll be able to get out of this situation once we put them there. So, to trigger our racks, we need a bunch of discard. So let's talk about our discard spells. We have many, many, many of them. First off, we have 4 copies of Wrenchmind. Wrenchmind is a 2 mana, double black mana, sorcery. It says target player discards 2 cards from his or her hand unless he or she discards an artifact card. So, it's basically the most efficient discard in Modern. Some decks do have artifacts, but against a lot of decks, this is just a 2 mana Mind Rot, which is a pretty good deal. Then we have 4 copies of Augur of Skulls, which is 1 and a black for a 1/1 creature. You can pay 1 and a black to regenerate it, but at the beginning of your upkeep, you can take and sacrifice Augur of Skulls and make a player discard 2 cards. So it's basically another Wrenchmind, but it has to sit out on the battlefield. For a turn before you can take advantage of the ability. Then we have 2 copies of Funeral Charm. This is a modal spell. So you get to choose one. It's a 1 mana black instant. You can choose to have a player discard a card, or you can have a creature get +2/-1, or you have a creature Swamp Walk until end of turn. So we never ever use the Swamp Walk ability. We sometimes, but not too often, use the removal ability against like a Dark Confidant, for example. +2/-1 is a pretty good deal. Kills Bob, kills Grim Lavamancer. There's some other creatures, a Delver before it flips. But the main thing this does is lets us make our opponent discard a card, and we can do it at instant speed. So we can wait until our opponent's draw step, they draw their card for the turn, and we immediately Funeral Charm and make them discard whatever they drew before they get a chance to play it. Then we have 4 copies of Blackmail. Blackmail is like this weird Thoughtseize variant. So 1 mana sorcery, target player reveals 3 cards from his or her hand. You choose one of them, that player discards the card. So when an opponent has 7 cards in their hand, Blackmail is worse than Thoughtseize significantly, because our opponent can just show us their 3 worst cards, so we end up making them discard a random land or whatever they don't need. However, once we play a couple Wrench Mines or Augur of Skulls and get our opponent down to 3 or less cards in hand, Blackmail is just better than Thoughtseize, because not only does it not cost life, but it can make an opponent discard lands. If they only have 3 cards in their hand, we get to see all 3 of them, and it doesn't matter. We can take a land, we can take an instant, a sorcery, a creature, no conditions set on it. Raven's Crime is an interesting one. 1 black mana sorcery, target player discards a card, but it has Retrace, so we can cast it from our graveyard by also discarding a land card. This is awesome because it's repeatable, and it's a hedge against flooding out. If we draw too many lands, we can always turn them into discard with Raven's Crime. On its face, just 1 mana sorcery, discard a card isn't very good, but the Retrace ability makes it playable. And finally, our last discard spell, Stupor, is 3 mana, the most expensive card in our deck, and it's a sorcery. Target opponent discards a card at random, then chooses and discards a card. So it's halfway a Hymn to Turak. You get the 1 random card discarded, plus 1 that our opponent wants to discard. So those are our discard spells. In all, 20 discard spells. So we have 8 racks, 20 discard spells. Then we have a few removal spells to take care of any creatures that might get on the battlefield. First off, Smother, 2 mana, instant, destroys a creature with converted mana cost 3 or less and it can't be regenerated. Then on the far side, we have Victim of Night, 2 black mana, instant, and it destroys target non-vampire, non-werewolf, non-zombie creature. In Modern, that's pretty much an unconditional removal spell. There really aren't too many vampires, werewolves, or zombies running around that we have to worry about. Then finally, in the middle, Smallpox. This one is both discard and removal. 2 black mana, it's a sorcery. Each player loses a life, discards a card, sacrifices a creature, then sacrifices a land. This card is awesome in our deck. It does everything we want to do. It gets rid of a creature, and it usually doesn't affect us because we don't have creatures. It makes our opponent lose a life, which is fine. We also lose a life, but whatever. We usually have lands, extra lands that we don't mind sacking or discarding. So why it's symmetrical? Because of how our deck is built, it typically hurts our opponent more than it hurts us. So that's our removal spells. Mana base wise, really, really simple. 19 Swamps and 2 Dakmor Salvage. So Dakmor Salvage might seem weird, but it synergizes really, really well with 2 cards. First off, we can sack it to Smallpox, and if we really need a land, we can dredge it back to our hand. That's the ability on it. It is taps to add black mana, enters the battlefield tap, but it has Dredge 2. So when we would draw a card, instead we can put the top 2 cards of our library in our graveyard and get Dakmor Salvage back to our hand. But it works really well with Smallpox because we can sack Dakmor Salvage, and if we need a land, we can get it back from the graveyard. And it works really, really well with Raven's Crime because once we get to this point where our opponent has 0 cards in hand, we want to make sure they stay at 0 cards in hand. Every turn, instead of drawing, we can dredge back our Dakmor Salvage, use that to pay the retrace cost on Raven's Crime, which means we need to discard a land along with paying the 1 black mana, and make our opponent discard their card, and do that again every single turn to make sure our opponent's hand stays empty. So that's the deck. The 8 racks, 20 discard spells, a handful of removal spells, and the lands. Sideboard-wise, we have 4 copies of Duress, more discard, 3 Nile Spellbombs. This one's really, really important because we're making our opponents discard, and some decks like discarding. Some decks want cards in their graveyard. Dredge is a big example of that. But this takes and lets us exile the graveyard for only 2 mana, or actually 1 mana, and it also lets us draw a card if we can pay an additional mana. A single Cunning Lethomancer, which I probably shouldn't have put in the deck. It is a 3 mana 2/2 that makes each person, each player, discard a card on their upkeep. We have 2 Dismembers for more removal, 2 more Stupors, and then 3 Languishes that we can bring in when we're in a matchup where we need removal that can sweep away the whole board. We would like to have Damnation in this slot, but since we're a budget deck, Languish is the best we could do. Anyway, this deck is pretty competitive. I think that what it comes down to is with this deck, there are not very many middling matchups. If we play a deck that is playing fairly and not super fast, like Burn or something, I think we have a very solid matchup, because those decks just really don't want to discard all the time. And this even includes Twin and some of the other major decks, Grixis Control, decks like that. However, there are some random matchups that you'll run into in Modern where opponents want to discard cards. For example, decks that are playing Loxodon Smiter, which goes to the battlefield when it's discarded, or Lingering Souls, which isn't bad to have in the graveyard, or of course Dredge decks, which love to put cards in their graveyard, or like Griselbrand, that was perfectly fine with letting you discard their Griselbrand on turn 1. So I think there are some really, really, really good matchups where we are hardly ever going to lose, and then there are some really, really, really bad matchups where we're hardly ever going to win, and then there's very few in-between matchups. So if you run into decent matchups, which there are plenty of with this deck, I think it's really super competitive. But if you run into a string of bad matchups, the deck is just hilariously bad. And the one problem with this deck, same as with all discard decks, as they say, is you can't make your opponent discard the top of their deck. So we can empty our opponent's hand, and if we don't have a rack on the battlefield to kill them quickly, we can't really do anything about that card they're drawing every turn. So in theory, they can draw their Siege Rhinos and Tarmogoyfs and Dark Confidants and Planeswalkers and just keep playing these every turn, because we really don't have ways to make them discard at instant speed, at least many ways, just the 2 Funeral Charms. So that is the inherent weakness with the strategy, is if we get a rack on the battlefield, we can usually kill our opponent quickly enough that that doesn't matter. But if we just empty their hand and don't have a rack effect, it's very possible that they can just beat us with the top of their library. So anyway, make sure to check out the article on mtggoldfish.com. That's where you find all my other articles, some great content by other people as well, decks prices, strategy, the metagame, basically anything and everything you could want related to Magic the Gathering. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to take a second and click that subscribe button, which will be appearing at the bottom of the screen shortly. Not only does that keep you up to date on all the latest and greatest in video content from MTG Goldfish, but it also is a huge favor for us if you would subscribe. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.